There's a huge discrepancy in these markets. There's so much growth potential for Bitcoin, right? It's still so early for Ordinals, and we're early in this bull cycle that we certainly believe that we are still in, despite this correction. If Ordinals does a 10th of what Ethereum NFTs did in 2021, 2022, that's a huge opportunity. Like, that's a monster opportunity, right? Like, that's the reason to get into Ordinals, is because it is still early.
Hey, Marconi here. I need your help to win a bet with Ben Lilly. He said the interest in crypto is so low that JLabs Digital could offer Jay, their personal AA trader, for free. And people still wouldn't take the 5 minutes to give it a try. I said, you are crazy, and I'll prove you wrong. So all you got to do is click the link here and sign up for Jay, and Ben loses, and he has to drink Earl Grey tea for an entire year with no espresso. And if you're wondering, what's Jay? Well, it's the AI software that's been used to power funds, trade desk, and over 9 figures of capital in some of the most extreme conditions in crypto. And now it's tuned to have one job: use lower risk trading strategies to consistently grow your account over time. And here's the best part. Jay does the trading so you can be in crypto without living crypto. You get to sleep, touch grass, and spend time with friends and family. Sounds perfect, right? Well, click the link here to get started. Let's get back to the show. Isabel Foxen Duke is a general partner at Unbroken Chain, the first institution-backed trading fund in the Bitcoin Ordinals ecosystem. Isabel was a key player in the launch of the Ordinals protocol, managing communications for Ordinals creator Casey Rodarmore from February to May of 2023. She has since worked closely with some of the most influential Ordinals projects in the world, including Raktoshi's Bitcoin Rocks, NodeMonks, and Ordinal Maxi Biz, as well as supporting the relaunch of the Layer 1 Foundation in an effort to establish governance guidelines for the BRC-20 standard. At Unbroken Chain, Isabel supports the fund's inscription trading strategy, manages relationships with key suppliers in the market, and directs investor relations. Isabel, welcome. I'm going to kick you off with the very first question, which is, what is your elevator pitch for investing in Ordinals?
So I think we need to first separate Ordinals from sort of like the broad scope of sort of Bitcoin Season 2 technologies that have been exploding and developing at a rapid pace since the launch of Ordinals. When Ordinals launched, which was essentially a way of creating NFT-like functionality on Layer 1 Bitcoin, it inspired builders to do all sorts of stuff, right? It kind of opened this can of worms of what's possible on Bitcoin that we never thought was possible. No one thought you could ever do NFTs on Bitcoin Layer 1. I mean, Bitcoin is a fungible standard. So, when Casey Rodarmore, the fearless leader of Ordinals, kind of figured out a way to give Bitcoin Layer 1 non-fungible kind of characteristics using an overlay called the Ordinals protocol on top of Bitcoin, doesn't change anything about the consensus rules, doesn't, do anything that affects Layer 1 Bitcoin and any kind of, we can get into whether or not it has negative externalities, I guess. But,
Some may think so, yeah.
Long story short, I think the bull case specifically for Ordinals, right? So specifically I'll speak for inscriptions first, and then we can get into the token side of things, but certainly on the inscription NFT side of things, I think people really underestimate collectibles as sort of, a use case and sort of monetizable, object set since the beginning of time, right? I mean, people have always collected collectibles. I often give the example of fine art being the fastest growing asset class in 2020. It dominated markets in 2020. I think the only thing that beat fine art as an asset class in 2020 was Bitcoin. I think people sort of disparage Ordinals and NFTs in general as sort of like, monkey pictures. And certainly there are a lot of projects that are going to go to zero. And that are, there's pump and dump scams. There's all the negative things that you hear about in the NFT world on Ordinals too. But this idea of being able to create long-standing collectibles on chain, which, was happening on Ethereum, but, really it was only CryptoPunks and like a couple other key projects on Ethereum that were really, truly on-chain collectibles, truly censorship-resistant collectibles. Ordinals has completely changed that, right? Like now you have a proper collectibles market that, is trading, has liquidity, clearly is a proven use case on the liquidity front. There's no reason, and it seems to be trading in lockstep with Bitcoin, right? Because these collectibles are Bitcoin denominated. there's like a much higher correlation to Bitcoin itself than obviously, NFTs or tokens trading on other chains. I think on the token side, you could say something similar, right? Like meme coins denominated in Bitcoin are just like fundamentally a little bit different than meme coins denominated in some other token. Mm-hmm. And we truly believe that people will pay a premium and that people are attracted to Bitcoin, that Bitcoin is the mother chain. Bitcoin is most people in crypto's first love. The only reason people ever used other chains to begin with is because these things were deemed impossible to do on Bitcoin. And now that's not the case. Now you can do these things on Bitcoin too.
Why do you think, you mentioned that even going back to the beginning of time, people have underestimated collectibles. It's not something that I would say TradFi is saying, well, that's a real investment class. Do you have any perspective, having been in the space now, specifically looking at ordinals, but maybe even broader than that, asking why that is the case, that it's always diminished as something that maybe you shouldn't be buying?
It's interesting. I mean, I think that it is a very, very risky asset class, right? So, if you think about the traditional art market, traditional art, fine art in 2020, like I said, fastest growing asset class other than Bitcoin, outperformed real estate, outperformed equities. But it was a very, very, very small percentage of the art world, right, that fell into that category, right? Like 99.99% of art, isn't particularly valuable. But when you combine art, and I think, good collectibles that people are, that real investors invest in are thinking about this. When you combine art or, I guess we could say the broader collectibles market, when you really think about what a collectible is, it usually is tied to some sort of not only like brand or vision or, community or, something visual that evokes something in people, nostalgia. It's also almost always tied to scarcity, right? So collectibles are a scarcity play. Anyone who knows Bitcoin well knows that the most important thing about Bitcoin is its proven digital scarcity, is the provability of the fact that there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. That is the number one most important feature in Bitcoin's code. And collectibles ultimately are valuable for similar reasons, right? Like there's only a certain number of Picassos, there's only a certain number of Van Goghs, and as much money and liquidity as you can put into the markets, that money is all going to be competing for the same number of Van Goghs, the same number of Picassos, which means, all else being equal, if there's more liquidity in the system, the value of a Picasso or a Van Gogh or any other collectible with proven scarcity is going to go up. And so I think that that's something that, people think of art and they don't necessarily think about that like key economic feature of art and collectibles. And why that ultimately is why many people do store their wealth in things like Picassos and Van Goghs. I mean, most of these really, really high-end art collections, right, historical paintings and things like that are sitting in vaults in Switzerland. They're not hanging on people's walls.
Until they come to the Bitcoin blockchain, and then we'll be able to see them. Well, maybe you could break down sort of this ecosystem a little bit more, because I think for those who are coming new to it, maybe new to Bitcoin, or even specific to ordinals, there's a lot of language we hear. We hear about ordinals. I mentioned BRC20 when I read your bio. We now have ruins. Could you give us a little bit of a map of reality of what those are, where they fit, how you guys think about them and contrast them when you're speaking to investors?
Yeah, so I think the first most important place to start is what is an ordinal, right? I mean, I think people think like ordinals, NFTs on Bitcoin, that must involve some bridge, that must involve some like weird side chain. Like, again, Bitcoin's non-fungible. How does this work? So really quickly, all an ordinal is a Satoshi, is an individual Satoshi on the Bitcoin blockchain with a serial number. The primary innovation of ordinals was that Casey Rodarmor, who was the creator of the standard, all he did, right? Like the most important main thing that he did that makes this technology possible is that he created a numbering scheme for every Satoshi on the blockchain. He numbered 1 through however many, like trillion to the nth degree, Satoshis on the blockchain. They all got unique ordinal numbers. That's where the word ordinal comes from. And then he created a client and wallet software that basically acknowledged this numbering scheme, right? So when Bitcoin moves, if you have a wallet that acknowledges the numbering scheme, you know which numbered Satoshis you have in your wallet, right? So that is literally all an ordinal is. It doesn't change Bitcoin at all, but it is firmly layer 1 Bitcoin. You are trading Satoshis. You are just trading Satoshis that the ordinal community basically has, through consensus, collectively decided has these certain serial numbers attached to them. And so, obviously, I think like the first use case for these, serial numbered Satoshis was like, okay, you basically have these little NFTs. Satoshis now become these little NFTs that people can trade. When you're making a Bitcoin transaction with one of these little tradable NFT Satoshis, you can attach image data to those Satoshi's literally right there in the layer one Bitcoin transaction. Like all you do is make a Bitcoin transaction with a Satoshi with a serial number on it. And all of the sudden, that image data is on layer one. It's a normal Bitcoin transaction and it is referenced and attached historically to that Satoshi for the rest of time, right? Because this is on layer one Bitcoin. You can't change it. You're making a layer one Bitcoin transaction when you make an ordinal transaction. So that is what an ordinal is. I think that that's really helpful context for understanding all the technology that's built on top of it. What happened about 5 months after Ordinals was launched on mainnet, was that this guy named Domo, who is the president of Layer 1 Foundation, which I'm closely involved with the governance foundation for BRC20. He's the inventor of BRC20. He basically said, well, what if instead of attaching monkey pictures to these Satoshis, these Satoshi transactions, what if instead of attaching monkey pictures, what if instead of attaching generative art or whatever the case may be, videos, anything, said, what if instead we attached little JSON files that basically outlined a rule set for a token standard, right? And so he literally just made an inscription, which is the act of attaching data to an ordinal. He made an inscription that was literally a JSON file instead of a monkey picture that said, I am creating Ordi. Ordi has a 21 million cap supply. The way that you mint Ordi is you create an inscription and you claim your Ordi through making inscriptions. You can claim up to this amount at a time until it mints out, until the 21 million mints out. And basically that's all he did. And a bunch of degens went for it. They minted Ordi out. They made a bunch of inscriptions claiming their right to this, effectively like these tokens that are Figment, it's like a Figment accounting standard in the sky, as is Bitcoin, by the way. And people minted them out and then eventually started trading them. And now BRC20s as a collective, Ordi specifically, that first token that he created, I think is like a 1 or 2 billion market cap right now, down from a high of like 4 billion, I think. I have to check those numbers. And then BRC20, the standard that he used to create this token, a bunch of people used that exact same formula to create an infinite number of other BRC20 tokens, SATS tokens, Pepe tokens, all using this formula that he standardized. And that market, I think, at its peak was a $9 or $10 billion market cap, the BRC20 market overall. So pretty interesting, right? I mean, these were simple experiments. These are, they're kind of populist in how simple they really are, right? You don't need to be a dev to create BRC20 tokens. Anyone can do it. And that clearly resonated with the market, right? I think that the degens absolutely loved these sort of populist, easy to use, easy to create tokens on Bitcoin. But again, you still have some scarcity because when you create a token, you define the supply of that particular token.
So there's a really interesting element there when you think about the wars or the struggles that have happened from a Bitcoin perspective. I joined the scene in 2017. There were discussions about block size that led to the split between Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash and then these other Bitcoins. But there was so much discussion about from the development community and having to go through this process to be able to add and develop new capabilities on Bitcoin. And then you see what you just said, right? This new standard comes out, allows people to, from a populist standpoint, really uncensored standpoint, create something on Bitcoin. And I know that's created a little bit of tension as well between some of the OG developers who have even called some of this material just pure spam, even calling for some of it to be censored. And then the others who I think are more excited about the potential for being able to extend the Bitcoin network to not just be a settlement layer, but actually have development capabilities on it. I mean, when you're talking to some of these, because you just mentioned being in touch with them, do you feel that energy resonating from these people?
The negative energy or the positive populist?
Let's start with the positive side first.
I mean, I think that the reason why Ordinals blew up, the reason why BRC20s certainly blew up, is because, you have two key things.
Hi there. Thanks for watching. If you want to get more great content like this show, hit the like and subscribe button right here. The more subs and views we get, the easier it is to book great guests. Thanks for the ongoing support. Back to the show.
Anyone can do it. You don't need to be a developer to use either of these technologies. It is available to all. It is completely permissionless, just like Bitcoin. Anyone who, if you can use Bitcoin, you can use Ordinals, right? I mean, it is as permissionless as Bitcoin itself. And I think that, it's interesting. Like, I think that there's like a large craving for that, in the crypto world in general, right? Like people want to bring these use cases to Bitcoin, but they're not able to. So they've been sort of using these other chains that are like, generally speaking, I think, have a lot of regulatory oversight by venture capitalists, and, they're dependent on developers to make changes and do things in order to, accomplish their needs, and, put new tokens out there or whatever it is that they want to create. This is like the easiest medium for anyone to create what they want. And yeah, I think that permissionlessness above all else, and that sort of like equality of access that Ordinals creates in the crypto markets, resonates with people who, I think, generally speaking, believe in those values to begin with. I mean, most people in crypto, I think, hold these sort of Bitcoin values of permissionlessness, censorship resistance. Again, everything you get with Bitcoin, all the things we care about and love about Bitcoin in terms of like ethics and sort of this like crypto anarchist sentiment. You get that with Ordinals. You get that with BRC20 inherently. So I think it was like a slam dunk in terms of like why, Ordinals didn't even have a comms team. I mean, I've like helped Casey out, but it was like just the two of us and like a handful of other people just kind of figuring it out on Discord, basically. And it blew up, right? With no money, no budget, basically. So pretty powerful. Like it really, clearly hit a chord. And
it feels like the origins of Satoshi. You think about like no budget, a bunch of interested people trying to bring these technologies together to come up with something exciting that really fit the sort of ethos of the crypto punks.
Exactly. I think one last comment I'll make about that, and I might be skipping ahead. I think we were maybe going to speak about this later, but I think that because anyone can use it and anyone can create tokens, and you don't need a ton of capital to create tokens, you don't need a ton of capital to create these projects. I think that was a big sigh of relief for a lot of retail investors who feel like they've been potentially taken advantage of by venture capitalists in previous cycles, right? I mean, there's, I think most investors are getting hip to the fact that like a lot of the development that's been happening on other chains, sort of preferences, venture capitalists buy in, they get these discounted tokens, retail often gets dumped on, retail is often like the loser in those situations, and they kind of know that, they're kind of getting hip to that. And I think that there's a real appreciation for the fact that is not as much happening on Ordinals, right? I mean, the most successful, most important projects on Ordinals were all kind of like underground projects that were created by like one single individual in most cases.
It's pretty phenomenal. Can you expand a little bit on Ruins? Because I know that's something that just came out in the last couple of months. It's got a lot of buzz, at least on X. And so how does this fit into the Ordinals picture?
So after BRC20 was created by this guy named Domo, there was some criticisms of BRC20 being sort of a little bit clunky, right? I mean, there's sort of a little bit of a cost to the simplicity of his system, which is that you have to constantly be making inscriptions, which are pretty data intensive, in order to move BRC20 account balances around on the blockchain. And so Casey, who is the inventor of Ordinals, he basically said, I don't think that this token standard makes sense. I don't like this token standard. It's taking, all of these inscriptions are so inefficient. There's got to be a more efficient way to create a token standard on Bitcoin, and that doesn't rely on Ordinals as like a second layer. Maybe we can bake a token standard right directly into Bitcoin instead of having these like multi-layered, first you have Bitcoin, then you have Ordinals, then you have BRC20 on top. And so he created something called Runes, which essentially is the same thing, right? It's writing a token standard rule set instead of onto an ordinal inscription, which is what BRC20 did. Runes is a standard that basically encourages people to create these rule sets in the op return of a Bitcoin transaction directly. And then there's a separate indexer that sort of tracks the account balances of this new protocol called Runes, which again, Runes very, very similar to BRC20. It just uses a different part of the Bitcoin transaction. Instead of using the ordinal inscription, it uses the op return, which is, a smaller data field, and also, doesn't have the same challenges in terms of like you always have to be constantly making these super data inscriptions, super data intensive inscriptions in order to move account balances around. So that came out. There was an enormous amount of hype about Runes. I think, a lot of people missed BRC20, right? I mean, the people who got into BRC20 first, the people who got into Ordi first, they sort of hit the jackpot, right? I mean, that was an incredibly like lucky thing to be able to get into BRC20 early. It basically means that you happen to see the right Twitter post at the right time and happen to have the wherewithal to go and mint it, right? And so I think there were a lot of folks who felt like FOMO. And so they started to like pump runes, and runes was something where you knew it was coming, right? Ordi, you didn't know it was coming. He just dropped Ordi, and then some people minted it, and then it started trading and it blew up. Runes, it was like Casey made an announcement that he was going to create this standard months before runes dropped. So you had all these degens who kind of missed the BRC20 wave, who were like, okay, this is where I'm going to make my money. I'm going to be the first to like, well, the second runes drops, I'm going to be right there and I'm going to mint the first runes, and that's how I'm going to get rich. And so you had a ton of people pumping up runes well before the standard was available. And you had basically the most crowded trade in history. You know, you had everyone trying to mint runes, people from other ecosystems, people from Ethereum, people who had never even heard of ordinals in their lives. Like everyone got the memo. Oh, runes, this is how you're going to get the first runes, and that's how you'll get rich. And so what happened was everyone went all over the crypto ecosystem, went to go mint these runes, and then there were no buyers to buy them, right? Like there was no one who's going to buy your bags when everyone's minting runes on day one. And so that basically marked, I think, a local top for the Bitcoin native assets ecosystem. And, you know, it was also kind of poorly timed, right? Like traditionally after the halvening, you also see Bitcoin correct because you have all these miners capitulating. We obviously had also these like other macro things happening with, you know, Germany and Mt. Gox and all of these reasons to create selling pressure. But I think, you know, certainly in the Bitcoin native assets ecosystem, the sort of crowded trade problem with runes was like yet another thing that created a lot of selling pressure all of a sudden. And, you know, that was sort of the beginning of the correction that we're currently in not only Bitcoin native assets, but Bitcoin and crypto generally right now.
Yeah, definitely a bit of a correction right now. As we're recording this on September 4th, I think the market's further down from where it was just a couple of months ago. We just had our weekly podcast, The Trading Pit, and we were talking about whether we should have sold in May and gone away, but another discussion for another day. So now you've laid out a map of this ecosystem that's growing. I do want to ask you a little bit about some of the DeFi stuff that's going to be coming up. But before we do that, I was hoping to get a little bit more of your perspective on, as a fund that's looking at actually investing in this space, active trading and investing in this space, how do you specifically look for projects that you think are going to last? They're going to have, from a price appreciation perspective, that they're going to have legs. From a multi-cycle, I guess I'd like to hear all that perspective on you've given out the thesis for why you're investing in ordinals and in the space at large, but what do you do to actually find a valuation framework to look at these specific projects?
So I'll speak on the inscription side of things because that's sort of more my area. But again, you know, our fund invests not only in inscriptions, but BRC20 tokens, runes, et cetera. Any Bitcoin native asset would be in our purview, but or in our mandate. But on the inscription side, I think that we are looking at, you know, a handful of things that are probably like pretty classical things that you know, any good trader is thinking about when they are potentially buying assets. We're looking certainly at things that I think you hear about all the time on social media, things like community and things like, you know, like who are the buyers, who are the holders, who are these people? We're looking at supply dynamics, right? Like how much of a particular collection does the team hold, you know, who is the team, you know, do we anticipate that they're going to be continuing to cheerlead for their project for a long time? All of those things. I think that these are kind of the things that people think about in the Ethereum and Solana NFT ecosystems, and they certainly hold true in ordinals as well. And, you know, those kinds of metrics are things that we've sort of brought over maybe from the Ethereum and Solana communities. I think something that's a little unique about ordinals, certainly that many people I think have also heard of, but something we definitely take pretty seriously or have taken a more bullish look at in the past is, you know, provenance, right? Like, and this certainly, again, exists in the Ethereum world, for instance, like something like CryptoPunks would be a good example. I just think there's a little bit, there's definitely this ability to look at the provenance on ordinals in a different way because A, all ordinals are 100% on-chain artifacts, and B, all ordinals are numbered, all inscriptions are numbered 1 through infinity from the time they're mined. This is a very unique feature to ordinals and inscriptions, is that Casey baked into the design of the ordinals client and the ordinals protocol that every inscription would get a number 0 through infinity. So you have a situation where like the first 100 inscriptions obviously going to trade at like an insane premium, right? Like those are crazy historical crazy historical collectibles, crazy historical artifacts, if you will. Digital artifacts is often what Kesey refers to them as. If Ordinals does well and if Ordinals blows up, those first 100, I would even say those first 1,000, some people would even say the first 10,000 or 100,000 are going to trade at a premium. We tend to, focus on the early inscription side. We think that those first 10,000 that's probably like a meaningful like scarcity limit. And it's something that we, think about deeply in terms of, what we're excited about on the historical front. Historical, like provenance related type things are definitely sort of like a bucket that we think about even beyond inscription numbers, though. Projects that are doing kind of interesting kind of creative pushes or doing something historical in some way that I think is provable on chain. That's a story that we really, really like. And I think Asher and I actually kind of like debate between the two of us. We're like, well, how much is the market going to continue to care about historical provenance? But it seems like up until this point, the market has continued to care about that in some way or another. For instance, with collections like Bitcoin Shrooms, which was like sort of the first original art collection on Bitcoin. And then also even something like Node Monks. We feel like Node Monks has been a little bit more resilient in this correction than something like Bitcoin Puppets, which is like a pure community play. So we look at a lot of different things. We're also like cautiously optimistic about fine art on Bitcoin. So we are very kind of hopeful, and we see there's like a universe where sort of the fine art Ethereum NFT plays come to Bitcoin, kind of like the art blocks of Ethereum and the fidenzas of Ethereum could potentially come to Ordinals, but that hasn't quite happened yet. And so we haven't done a ton in that space because we just don't see it yet. But we believe and hope that it is coming.
I hope maybe you could expand on that a little bit more, because I just read a paper, I think it was from Multicoin Capital, and they were talking a little bit about provenance and where they saw sort of these marketplaces being on chain, being able to expand. And they talked a little bit about tethering, not tether, the actual word, but tethering aspects of the blockchain to non-digital artifacts. So if you had like a Rolex watch or something like that, it could be inscribed or it could be added into the chain. What do you think about that play? Because you just mentioned fine art. Are we actually saying fine art would be inscribed on the chain? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So we're thinking when we talk about fine art on chain, we're specifically talking about, like super intentional art, usually by, theoretically by like a professional digital artist, that is inscribed onto the blockchain, right? So instead of like, okay, we're going to do monkey pictures where it's basically like a set number of features that are randomly assigned. And like, there's, clearly like a collectibles play with something like a Node Monks or a Puppets, but, the art itself is, they're not individual unique pieces, right? And they're not, there's probably a lower level of intentionality in the art. Although sometimes I would make the claim that the art is good. I'm sure those too in my own weird like white trash aesthetic that I like. But I would say like art with like a high level of intentionality by the artist is like the best way that I would describe like fine art on chain, right? So it depends on the level of intentionality of the art. So that's sort of what we're talking about when we talk about fine art on chain. I think what you're talking about is sort of like real world assets on chain, right? Like the on chainification of real world assets, which is definitely a meta that you are seeing in the crypto world. And there's a lot of people trying to make that happen. I won't speak for the fund on this. We don't have anything like that in the fund. I'm personally like a little bearish on it. I think that, the whole point of putting something on chain is so that it becomes unconfiscatable essentially and permissionless. And like, yeah, you can prove that you have essentially like a certificate of ownership of something through having a digital token perhaps, but like ultimately like that's not going to change. That's not going to like stop somebody who has a gun from like going to your house, holding a gun to your head and like taking your Rolex or taking your Picasso or whatever it is, right? Or taking your house, right? I mean, like as in the government confiscates real estate all the time. And so I think that use case is just sort of kind of misses the point of like what Bitcoin is about and what Bitcoin's for. And we think it'll, I'm not sure it holds that much more. It's like maybe marginally or incrementally better than like having a certificate on a piece of paper, but not that much is sort of my point of view.
I'm hearing a little bit of Bitcoin versus blockchain.
I'm a Bitcoiner, you guys. We're Bitcoiners. That's what we are.
Fair enough. I want to go in and talk a little bit about this idea that this ecosystem that you talked about, you mentioned just a couple of minutes ago that it's really permissionless, right? It's not having a lot of VC funding. And so that's a little bit dynamic relative to the rest of the market, which has experienced quite a bit more funding, billions of dollars. In fact, I think was the number I was reading this morning. And then you have the idea that even a single developer or builder could create these collections. So when you think about going in, you talked about provenance, about this area of like what's early and what matters. And you also talked about community. How important is it just to be on X or going to I guess meetups where you're just interacting with people all the time to get a feel? Because it feels a little bit more like if it was in the real world, going to like Soho, and I'm going to butcher this because I don't know where anything actually happens in New York, but I'm thinking like people back in the day going to like the meatpacking district and just meeting up with people randomly and then being like, oh, this person's really interesting. And then just following and communicating with them. And next thing you know, something actually happens. Is that sort of the work that has to get done to figure out where the value is going to be? It's just actually networking with people?
Yes and no. I mean, so I do think that there's a lot of people who end up buying shitcoin art because they like met some artist on a weekend and they like made friends with them and bought their art, and it's like actually worth nothing. Like you said, like what actually makes art valuable, and like the probability of like a number go up situation with a piece of art, just like the probability of a number go up situation with an NFT is like a little bit more like complex than that. And right, that's usually what people are looking for. They're usually not just looking to hang something on their wall. If they're spending a ton of money on something, they're usually hoping that it appreciates or at least holds its value. And so, yeah, I mean, I think where networking comes into play is like if you network effectively and you kind of get in with the communities, right, that are actually providing liquidity to prop up a market, you can get a sense of how much of the like you can make more educated bets about like, again, who are the buyers, what is the team, what are the supply and demand dynamics for this particular collection, and potentially make projections based on a whole host of things about where you see that going over time and like what the growth trajectory is based on like various factors. So yeah, I do think that networking is really important. I mean, I definitely spend a ton of time talking to project founders and community members. And I would say it is equally important that I talk not just to the founders, but to the community members, that I'm watching what they're doing online. I mean, networking for sure, but also just like watching, right? Like if I tweet like Bitcoin puppets, like that's the most popular tweet of the week for sure. 100%. Like always gets a million retweets, always gets a million likes, always gets a million comments. Like Bitcoin puppets, like for whatever reason, like they just show up to the party. And so, you know, that's not a plug for Bitcoin puppets necessarily, not financial advice, but it's just an observation, right? Like those kinds of like being in the community, being on the ground and seeing what's going on is certainly important for sure.
Is there anything that you've gotten from a community as you've started to network with them, not so much the builders or the founders, but you're thinking about the actual community that's been a surprise, just hearing their observations, their perspectives, what they want more of, what they want less of? I'm always curious to hear like on the ground information that's just a little bit surprising.
You know what? I think that like the community doesn't always equal liquidity. I think is something for people to remember. So there's a lot of communities that are really loud, but maybe it's like made up of community members that are, you know, kind of not as liquid, right? Like don't have as much cash to throw around. Versus, and I think actually if you like want to compare like Node Monks and Bitcoin Puppets, right? Like Bitcoin Puppets is by far and away like much louder, like way, you know, kind of more visible community online than Node Monks. But folks who are holding Node Monks seem to be more diamond handed. There's a lot of like pretty deep Node Monk whales. The people that I know who are like hardcore Node Monk bulls tend to be a little bit sort of like bigger, whalier traders maybe. And again, these are all things that, you know, the dynamics change, right? These aren't fixed dynamics, but that's just something that I observed about like comparing those two collections, for instance. Like, I think you have, there can be very, very, very valuable collections that you've never heard of because they have a small but mighty group of buyers who prop up their price, right? So noise and liquidity are not always equivalent is something to just be aware of, perhaps.
Yeah, it can definitely get noisy out there on X, especially when the market goes a little south. What do you think is the perhaps the best criticism of investing in this space? And it can be specific to Ordinals, it could be specific to runs, maybe it's more specific to collectibles, but what is something that you've heard? Maybe first it's more like, what's the common criticism that you hear that maybe it's easier to dismiss, and then something else that is a little bit easier and something that maybe people just need to be aware of if they're looking at this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really what it boils down to is like, so you often hear the criticism of like, there's no inherent value, there's no utility, right? Everything's going to zero. And I think that there's like a grain of truth to that, right? Like, first of all, like, yes, like most Ordinals collections are going to zero, just like most paintings that are painted are going to zero, right? I mean, that's just the reality of the situation. Like Ordinals, in terms of just like every Ordinal on the planet is not going to ever become or certainly maintain value. It's a very, 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 very specific collections that are probably going to, outperform Bitcoin, for instance, like over the next, some time, right? And I think also, Asher and I often talk about the fact that like Bitcoin, like Ordinals, we believe like our bet is that Ordinals will be a multi-cycle play, but we're not attached to that, right? Like if Ordinals are just a play for this cycle, that is what that is. And that's certainly a possibility, right? Like I think one of the criticisms I hear a lot is like, oh, this is just a trend. And it's like, well, most trading happens on trends. Again, we think that Ordinals probably has enough strength and enough kind of resilience to survive multiple cycles. But, there's a possibility that it just literally is like a one cycle play. And like there are people who are going to make money off of that. And we're certainly trading it. I think, I forget what the other.
Yeah, it was a question of like, what's criticism that you kind of brush away, and then what's good stuff? Yeah.
I want to just add one thing. So I think that that's sort of like something that, is sort of a criticism, but it's also just like, it's a reality. Who cares? Like it doesn't change that much about how people who are interested in Ordinals are playing Ordinals. And like, yeah, like they are just like fun monkey pictures. Again, like people underestimate that like collectibles are something that people have been trading and investing in and playing with since the beginning of time. Like, I don't think that that's a super legitimate criticism. Like, some people aren't going to be into it, but clearly it is proven that lots of people are, right? It's like gambling as a use case, right? And I think that's probably a little bit more severe, but I think a lot of crypto tokens, especially, could easily be compared. The reason why people are attracted, especially to token trading, is like a gambling sensibility. And people criticize, token trading as if it's gambling, and trading in general, arguably, is sort of like a form of gambling, but it's like, who cares? Like, why is that a problem necessarily? Like, as long as you have, kind of like informed consent, gambling is also a use case as old as time, right? This is a proven use case. There is a market for gambling. It is one of the most important, most lucrative markets in the world. So I don't really see it as a great criticism, right? I mean, it might be a reason why some people might not want to get involved, and that's healthy. Ordinals is not for everyone. Gambling's not for everyone. Tokens not for everyone. Crypto trading not for everyone. But it doesn't change the fact that some people are going to do it, and there's clearly an enormous proven market for it. Like saying that that's not like a legitimate use case just doesn't make sense. Yeah. And then the last thing that I will kind of say on that front is sort of the no utility argument, which obviously Bitcoin gets that criticism a lot too. I think that's just some carryover Bitcoin FUD, the no utility argument. I'm a little bearish on things that do have utility. I feel like utility is often, again, sort of becomes this rationalization for venture capitalists and developers to like extract liquidity from a system when, like, let's be real, like most of these use cases are like not going anywhere. And, they just end up sort of being narrative fodder for these gambling games, right? But they're like pretending to be something they're not. Ordinals is at least being honest about what it is, right? Like, yeah, we're like playing a little bit, I don't mean to disparage it too much. Again, there is the sort of fine art aspect as well. And I think collectibles are super special, but there's definitely that they are kind of like non-utility and most things in crypto we're just not lying about it.
We're the non-liars. Trust us. We don't lie about it. We don't put something on. I think that's great. So I want to pivot a little bit and talk a little bit about ecosystems, also get a little bit into sort of the DeFi Bitcoin space, because I know you've hosted some conversations recently about that. And so I'd love to get your perspective there. But before we do that, when I think about the case that you just made for Ordinals, I know oftentimes it's compared to what was seen in the Ethereum ecosystem or in the Solana ecosystem, which are much larger, at least last time I checked the data. And I'm not going to quote specific data because I'll get it wrong and then I'll get a bunch of people in the comments. But Do you see Bitcoin needing to compete with those ecosystems for the same buyers of the art? Or do you think that Bitcoin being the largest ecosystem is able to create something new, differentiated, and therefore it's really not going to have to compete with those? And almost you have two different ecosystems, people that are really excited about what's happening on Ethereum versus those are excited about what's happening on Bitcoin.
Yeah, so some people might not like my answer to this, but like the reality of the situation is that Ordinals versus Ethereum NFTs is not a Bitcoin versus Ethereum conversation, really. I mean, most people who are invested in Ordinals or who are buying or trading Ordinals did come from the Ethereum and Solana ecosystem. Like maxis are not trading Ordinals, right? Like that's not what Bitcoin maxis want to do. The people who are interested in Ordinals are people who are already interested in collectibles and NFTs, right? Like Ordinals are collectibles and NFTs first, right? Ordinals are not, rapidly converting maxis into becoming like day traders or anything. And it's not like changing like the Hodler thesis, right? So yes, most people who are in Ordinals come from the Ethereum and Solana ecosystems. And yes, there is some limitation to how much liquidity is in those systems. And so some of that liquidity is going to leave Ethereum and Solana. It has left Ethereum and Solana, and it's going to go to Bitcoin Ordinals. I believe that's going to continue probably. I mean, to your point, right? There's a huge discrepancy in these markets. Bitcoin has there's a huge opportunity, right? I mean, there's so much growth potential for Bitcoin, right? It's still so early for Ordinals, and we're early in this bull cycle that we certainly believe that we are still in, despite this correction. So, I think that that's part of the bull case for Ordinals, right? Is like if Ordinals gets even, a tenth, if Ordinals does a tenth of what Ethereum NFTs did in 2021, 2022, that's a huge opportunity. Like that's a monster opportunity, right? Like that's the reason to get into Ordinals is because it is still early.
I want to take that idea and take it down a little bit further into this notion of retail. We've talked about it before that one of the comments made on Unbroken Chain's website is the idea of retail being a driver of this moment. You mentioned it hasn't been VC driven before. It was just the two of you guys that started, you and Casey going there, to communicate out what's happening with Ordinals. Talk a little bit about your thesis for why retail is going to continue to come back, because I think most people would argue that since, going back to 2023 at this point, we really haven't seen a surge of retail coming back to the market. Is your thesis still holding that is going to happen? What are you looking for to actually confirm that it has happened?
Do you mean retail, like non-crypto retail coming into crypto, or do you mean like Ethereum and Solana retail users coming to Ordinals?
Let's start with the first one, the non-crypto people coming into the ecosystem.
Yeah. I personally, my observation of previous cycles is that, every time you have a big number go up moment with Bitcoin, you do get more retail coming in, right? I don't see that trend stopping this year. Like there's no reason to believe that trend will stop, right? Like if Bitcoin goes to 100, 150,000, wherever it's going to get in this, again, coming bull market that again, we believe that we are still in. Some people might just disagree with that. But, if Bitcoin is breaking new all-time highs after new all-time highs, yeah, you're going to get new retail investors, right? People are going to get interested. You're going to see Bitcoin in mainstream news. You're going to see all the things that happened in 2020 happen again in 2025. And so I think that's, the reality of the situation is we have been in a bear market for the past several years. I don't think we really saw meaningful new retail adoption in 2023. We haven't seen meaningful new retail adoption since the last bull market. That's when new retail gets into crypto. And I do see that. I don't see why that trend would change.
What about the ecosystem as it is today? You have the ones you mentioned earlier that, yes, you've had some movement already happen where people that have invested in projects on Ethereum or Solana have come over to Bitcoin. Do you see that continuing? I mean, one thing I would say that's a little bit distinct about this whatever cycle, I'm not even sure exactly what we'll call what we are right now, is that, if I'm 2017 where I joined, you saw a rush in altcoins, I think primarily driven by ERC20 tokens, starting to happen long before Bitcoin even moved into its crescendo. And then you had another massive wave, but you saw a lot of movement happen. This cycle, it's basically been Solana and Bitcoin. And then you've got, the meme coins that have done really well. And then you've had some of what we talked about in the last 30, 45 minutes. What do you think about that? Do you see a conversion process happening where more of those people that have been altcoin, do you think that they're becoming Bitcoiners? Do you think that they're just going to expand and be multi-coiners? How do you think about those movements?
I think most of them are multi-coiners, right? Like that's the reality of like altcoiners in general, is that they tend to be chain agnostic, right? It's, you might have like an occasional ETH maxi, but like for the most part, like, right, like you don't see people in altcoin land who are like so attached to their own chain that they won't take a money making opportunity somewhere else, right? Like I feel like the distinction between Bitcoin maxis and altcoiners of all kinds, or is that altcoiners of all time, like they just go where the opportunity is. And so if the opportunity is with ordinals, that's where they're going to go. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it does. I'm curious, in your fund, have you had people come up to you and say, listen, until I met you guys, I'd only been one type of thing, and now I'm just super excited to get into Bitcoin? Have they actually just expressed that to you directly?
Oh, a ton of people. Again, most people who are coming into ordinals are coming in from other ecosystems. Bitcoin maxis are not adopting ordinals. That's like not really a thing. Like I can count them on all five on two hands, and I probably know them all. Like it is the vast majority of people who are coming into ordinals are people who live in a multi-chain universe, and they will continue to live in a multi-chain universe. Most people who own Bitcoin, spot Bitcoin, are not Bitcoin maxis, right? Most people who own Bitcoin are altcoiners, right? Are people who own a wide variety of crypto tokens, right? That is the majority experience. Bitcoin maximalism is a teeny tiny demographic. I think there's like estimated 10,000 people in the entire world who identify as as Bitcoin maximalists, and everyone else is living in this multi-chain universe. And so I think ordinals appeals to the multi-chain universe people. Maxis, the hodler maxis are not interested in day trading monkey pictures. But I think that you're going to just see, like ordinals and therefore Bitcoin denominated assets, and probably spot Bitcoin as well, is going to become a bigger portion of this average multi-coiners portfolio as ordinals grow.
I like to hear that. I'm actually very curious to see if the Bitcoin maxis go the way of the dodo. And part of me wants to see that, not because I have so much animus. Like, fine, if this is the only way it's going to go, that's fine. I'm kind of tired of the vitriol. It seems like they move away. Many of them, not all of them, but many of them move away from making good cases to just getting spiteful and mean. And it's hard as a recovering Bitcoin maxi myself, and somebody who spent an enormous amount of time in that world. I think they make a lot of good points. I think they have a lot of really good intentions. I think they care about consumer protection. I think they're concerned about pump and dumps. I think they're concerned about, new retailers who might not know the difference between Bitcoin and Ethereum, like accidentally, buying stuff that's going to ultimately go to zero and spending their life savings on things that, really can't be relied on as like a long-term store of value. I know so many retailers or people who got into this ecosystem for those reasons. So I get where the maxis are coming from, and I'm like with them on that. But I think, to your point, what's sad about the Bitcoin maxis is that the tribalism and the kind of the cancel culture vibe of Bitcoin maximalists and sort of the shaming culture around it is such that they kind of are shooting themselves in the foot, and they actually sort of discredit themselves a little bit in a lot of ways. And sometimes it even results in them, I think, stepping into actions and taking actions that are not in integrity with their own value system. And I think the best example of that is obviously ocean mining, right? So, you had these sort of really hardcore, Bitcoin ethos minded developers who built this very, very important decentralized mining pool technology that solves a huge, probably one of the most core fundamental existential threats to Bitcoin is centralized mining pools. And how do we solve that problem? And they've put out this product that really promised to do that. And then they, started, censoring ordinals transactions because they didn't like ordinals, because they didn't want to be seen as supporting ordinals because of the tribalism and the cultism, which is, of course, completely antithetical to Bitcoin. I mean, censoring layer one Bitcoin transactions is the absolute opposite of what any Bitcoin maximalist would ever think is appropriate in, this technology, which is based on it's fundamentally most important core value is censorship resistance, right next to that 21 million that I talked about earlier. So yeah, I think that's the sad part is there's a lot of really good things that kind of come out of that ethos, but the tribalism and the shaming and the cancel culture and the, just cultural problems in the political arena of the Bitcoin maximalist world make it such that sometimes they can be harmful. Yeah. I fully agree. You said it really, really well, so I'm not going to double down on that too much. Although I will say I recently read a post from someone who's all over Twitter, Michael Schellenberger, and he was looking at why people react a certain way and why they become hypocritical in their own beliefs. And he cited, I think, some research that was looking at how people, when they have this cognitive dissonance that is frustrating them, they actually end up doubling down on their principles, but in ways that allow them to distort them, which to the point you just made, they come up with, they have the principle of saying, well, we're censorship resistant, and then they have to go against that because of this idea that, well, but we only can have a certain kind of tribe that's allowed in. And it's an interesting observation. But this next part that I want to ask you about may actually upset more maxis. I don't know. I hope not. I'm not actually here to piss people off.
Used to it.
I wanted to kind of pivot away because we were talking about ordinals, but there's a whole lot of work that's happening right now on sort of this Bitcoin DeFi, if you want to call it that. I'm not sure if that's the right term. Maybe you can correct that because you're talking to some of these projects perhaps a little bit more. But when I mention that, when I look at the projects, things like Bitcoin OS, Arch Network, Liquidium, and Fractal, and what's interesting to me is I know you hosted a space recently talking, I believe it was to Fractal. You can correct me on that. But if I look at all these systems, they're finding new ways of integrating with Bitcoin. It appears some of them, at least, are getting into more of using the existing base set. So like adding EVM type of capabilities, but without trying to compromise what Bitcoin is and its accounting system and the rules that it has in place. Can you just, having spoken at least to some of those projects, can you just give an overview of what you're seeing, how you think that relates at all to the ordinal space, which, we talk about being a lot more on the art side of it, but it's really building natively into Bitcoin, which I find really interesting. Can you just open that up a little bit more?
Yeah, we're attempting. I mean, so I'll just say right off the bat that many of these kind of new Bitcoin L2s that are popping up are not native to Bitcoin, right? They are typically more often than not, side chains. And side chains is not necessarily a new technology, but you're seeing new ways of building, side chains and, side chains with slightly different features than what was built in the past. But, I would say that probably 99% of these L2s are not like entirely new ideas. I mean, we have been trying to fix primarily the scaling problem on Bitcoin since forever and ever. And then also, obviously, since Ethereum was created, I think there's been like a little bit of an obsession of how do we make Bitcoin more programmable, which would obviously enable, all sorts of new kind of fintech, trading technology, et cetera. Bitcoin DeFi, that's where I would start to think about, the term Bitcoin DeFi is how do we create some sort of programmability functionality for Bitcoin and what technology might serve that. And again, people were attempting to do this in previous cycles. I think in previous cycles, the way that people did that was, again, bridging Bitcoin assets into some other blockchain, typically, sometimes side chains, but sometimes just completely different layer one blockchains. Even like a wrapped Bitcoin would be a good example. And then executing smart contracts and sort of executing programmability functionality on that other chain with some sort of like wrapped Bitcoin or custodial Bitcoin underneath. I think we're seeing a lot of similar flavors to that in a lot of instances with like new wrapping paper on it, because we're seeing all of this investor interest come into Bitcoin because of ordinals, right? Like the success of ordinals has sort of incentivized this Bitcoin season 2, this renewed interest in Bitcoin. And so you're seeing all this sort of VC money that was last cycle all in, Ethereum and other chains coming back to Bitcoin. And they're many of them are sort of doing all of their old same tricks as they've always done, but kind of like rebranding it as the sort of like Bitcoin season 2, Bitcoin layer 2 language. That being said, so that's sort of my cynical point of view on this. There are some really interesting, innovative technologies that are being developed that I think meaningfully solve, or at least meaningfully attempt to solve problems with the attempts at scaling or making programmable Bitcoin last cycle or in previous cycles. So the holy grail, Arch Network is like a really interesting example, and there's a couple other companies doing similar things where, is there a way, the holy grail of of an L2 would be, is there a way to create programmability on Bitcoin or create or scale Bitcoin in some way without actually having to have a custodial bridge, right? Where you're basically sending your Bitcoin to keys that aren't yours and then hoping that you're going to get that money back out at the end. that I think Arch Network is the reason I brought them up is I think they're working on like an interesting solution. I think they're actually doing sort of cutting edge technology. You know, they're actually pushing the envelope on thinking about ways that you could accomplish that. Even BRC20 Foundation is working on something similar with the BRC20 programmability module. There's a lot of really interesting kind of use cases for indexers as sort of a technical path to kind of create programmability on Bitcoin without having to have these sort of traditional custodial bridges. So yeah, I would say my general point of view about the sort of L2 explosion that's happening on Bitcoin right now is like, be careful. Like a lot of it is the same shit, for lack of a better word, in like new clothes. But there are some exceptions to that. And, you know, some people who I think are interesting, you know, really, you know, meaningfully pushing the envelope forward in terms of figuring out how to create scalability on Bitcoin without custodial risk.
I think that specific point that you just made about this idea of custodial risk is one that is probably lost by a lot of people that are very interested to see the tech. I brought up the Bitcoin maxis just a couple of minutes ago because I've seen so much discussion and so much pushback from OG developers on Opcat. Right. So, you know, my understanding, I think, is that the Opcat upgrade, which I think several people on X are constantly talking about that. I think there's a whole art project around the cat, which is this idea of getting the op category reinstated. It was originally there on Bitcoin, is my understanding. It was taken out for risk concerns, and there's been a movement to try and get it added back in. That would, by some people say, that would allow them to actually be doing these other types of chains, these side chains and drive chains, and I know I could probably make a hash of those technical distinctions between them, but you've seen a lot of pushback on that, right? This idea that we don't need that. We can ossify Bitcoin's L1 chain. It's just a settlement layer. We don't need any of that other stuff. We should just leave it to kind of being digital gold. And then you see the tension now with all these people, as you're saying, they're trying to build these additional capabilities because they like the security settlement network of Bitcoin, but they want some of the other programmability, which I just find very interesting. I mean, from your perspective, you say it's early days. There's a lot of shenanigans happening, so you need to be really concerned. What's your perspective on, can they solve these problems without having to do the custodial? Is op category the implementation of that, which I believe is in testnet right now? Does that need to happen in order for us to move forward and really get some of these capabilities? Or is that just a distraction because that would just maybe even lead to a little bit more of this custodial issue?
I mean, that's a great question. And I don't think it's one that anyone can answer because you can't tell the future, right? I mean, no one thought NFTs were possible on Bitcoin without making a, you know, BIP level change, right? Like a consensus layer change. And it turns out they are, right? It just required a little bit of creative thinking and, you know, and a developer figured it out. So, you know, the answer to the question is Opcat, which is a Bitcoin improvement proposal that's on the table that basically puts forth the possibility of including a new opcode into Bitcoin that enables covenants, which, I mean, you could think of as sort of like conditional transactions, sort of smart contract-esque transactions, very simplified version of smart contract-esque transactions on layer one Bitcoin. I think, like, do we need that BIP to go through? Do we need that layer one consensus level change to go through in order to have this functionality on Bitcoin? You know, we'll never know, right? I mean, there's a lot of people who are trying to create programmability and scalability on Bitcoin without having to make a consensus level change, and also without having to, you know, assume the custodial risks that, you know, most other previous technologies had to deal with. So who knows? What I will say is I am very sympathetic. I'm empathetic to folks who are concerned about implementing Opcat. You know, I think that making layer one Bitcoin level changes is a big deal, and we should be careful about that, right? I mean, Bitcoin has become this incredibly important, incredibly like life-saving proven thing for so many people. I think, you know, screwing with base layer consensus changes is always really scary, and I understand why that scares people. At the same time, yes, there is a universe where Opcat is or something similar to Opcat, maybe not Opcat, but Opcat or a similar, Bitcoin improvement proposal layer change, consensus layer change will be required to create programmability and scalability on Bitcoin. And there are many people who would make the argument that there's a limit to Bitcoin's growth, Bitcoin's adoption, Bitcoin's usability as a medium of exchange, for instance, and these other sort of money use cases, if we don't have programmability and scalability on Bitcoin. And there's a lot of people who make the argument that, just being digital gold is really not enough. And, if it takes a consensus layer change to get it done, as long as we're being careful about it, we should. So I kind of fall a little bit neutral on that argument myself. I kind of understand all sides.
Yeah, fair enough. I think I'm very interested to see where the growth can happen and the creativity. I think Ordinals has given this explosion. I'm excited for it. And so when I think about some of the other projects that could happen, I agree, like the sort of the Chesterton, I think it's the term Chesterton conservatism, which has moved very, very slowly with these changes and then be thoughtful about it is definitely the correct approach. That's what I would vote for. Although everyone's asking me, no one's asking me for my thoughts there. I have a few more questions. Do you still have a few minutes to... Okay, great. You have an interesting perspective, being that you've been comms in the Bitcoin space. You've worked with, I mentioned already, Casey, I mentioned Layer 1. You had a previous life doing internet marketing, which was very successful. I'm curious, what is your perspective being on the inside, right? Having worked directly with people that maybe the people that are on the outside don't really have. They don't really necessarily understand or appreciate about the conversations, the challenges, something that's kind of interesting that maybe they're just not aware of that you would only have from an insider perspective.
Oof, like just being a insider perspective in the ecosystem in general, or specifically on the comm side?
Well, maybe we can start with the comm side, because there's a fascinating part where, just to rewind what we just talked about, this the two of you guys, right? Maybe there's a third person or fourth person, but it's a really small team. Asking yourself, how do we get this out there? How do we, as someone who has expertise in marketing, right? That usually has a different kind of backing. You're now in a new product set, and it's just a different way of thinking. And then you're having these conversations. What is, you have investors that probably have a series of assumptions about what it's like to be on the ground and with the troops. I'm kind of curious what your perspective is, having that firsthand.
Ordinals was like a little bit of a unique situation because it was sort of like a home run, that ship was going to take off no matter what we did. And there was Casey really did. It had the fastest growing Discord server in the world before any press media even picked up the story of Ordinals. Ordinals is like a force. It drew in the degens in a way that I don't know if there's another example of that in crypto history, with no, again, no money, no promotion. We really barely did anything. By the time I got on board, we already had the fastest growing Discord in history. And I saw it and I couldn't believe that the press wasn't talking about it. And the press was, kind of asleep at the wheel, as I've said on other interviews. I couldn't believe that, the media professionals weren't paying attention. Meanwhile, you have this rush of retail that literally is coming in mostly through word of mouth, social media, underground channels. Talk about evidence of the power of retail communities just activating together and blowing something up completely organically. It's an incredibly rare phenomenon, right? There's very few examples of something like that ever happening in Bitcoin or crypto's history ever. So I certainly can't take any credit for that. And I don't think we did anything particularly unusual to make that happen. I think that the story of what Ordinals which is this idea of giving NFT functionality to Bitcoin Layer 1 and enabling people to do one of their favorite pastimes, which is, trade NFTs directly 100% on chain on Bitcoin, the mother chain Layer 1. I think that story just sold itself, you couldn't keep people away. I think, on the comms side, every comms experience I've ever had in the digital asset space has been really different. I think something that people don't realize maybe on the outside is how startup-y all of these projects are, even the ones with tons of funding and venture capital investment. It's they're all throwing Jello against the wall and seeing what fits is really, or what sticks is really the reality of what it's like to work in these crypto companies. It is ultimate startup land where everyone's just sort of figuring it out. And what worked at the last project might work at the next project, but might not. And you got to get creative and you got to problem solve. And it's always new and different. And I personally have not found like a cookie cutter like formula for comms in the space. I mean, I've obviously picked up tricks here and there. Sometimes my tricks work, sometimes they don't. The goal is to collect as many tricks as possible in your particular field to have as many tools in the arsenal to try to accomplish your goals. But it's really like startup land to the max at almost all of these companies, including some of the biggest, most well-funded crypto companies in the world.
That's fascinating. There's a sense of you'll see profiles on X as an example, right? And the profile gives a certain sense of how it projects a certain image, if you will, right? And so I think this idea that people are in a boardroom are probably dispersed geographically. I mean, I think it's probably more the case that they're not in a local space trying to create the protocols or the projects and then throwing Jello at a wall. It's interesting, right? I think it probably contrasts a little bit about maybe what we think they're actually doing day-to-day basis. But I think that's great.
All the time. I mean, think about, some of the most well-funded VC-backed projects in the world are like, this is going to be the new blockchain technology that changes the world. They have like a fucked up token launch. They're out. They're done, So, it happens all the time, more often than not.
All right. That's good insider perspective. All right, I got one last question here. Maybe it's a little boring, but you did a post on X. It was a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago now. It's politics season right now, right? And you actually reshared a post you had done at Bitcoin Magazine from 2022, I believe, which you talked about your transformation for having your ideals, which actually it doesn't sound like they really changed. I think what changed was sort of your perspective on the way in which you actually could achieve those. And so maybe your views on Bitcoin changed a little bit. And we can link to the article because I think it's worth a read here. And I'm not here to plug politics necessarily. I guess I'm more curious about what do you see as the potential future for Bitcoin if you were able to see a world like 4 years or 8 years where Bitcoin is and where what the community and sort of the evolution has achieved. What do you think that looks like?
To me, the most important function of Bitcoin, after just like the basics of, providing individuals financial freedom because they're not losing their purchasing power, every day it's melting away through the dollar. The most important function of Bitcoin after that is just holding governments accountable. So I think like the crux, I've been through a real just political kind of rebirth, I would say, over the past 3-4 years. I think a lot of people have, and I think Bitcoin definitely taught me a lot and challenged a lot of my existing previously held beliefs, which mostly my previously held existing beliefs were, I think the biggest thing that really got challenged was sort of like my faith in the government to make decisions, and so, that's not, for me, it is very staunchly like not a left-right thing. Although obviously I think, certainly right now, I think, the left side is like a little bit, is obviously more on the establishment train right now, given just the candidates that we have on the ticket. But that's changed, right? In other contexts, it's been the Republican side that's been more establishment, right? I think what Bitcoin really can do, though, is that Bitcoin really it just shines a spotlight on whatever the government is doing, particularly on the economic spending side of things, and it holds governments accountable for their behaviors economically and how those behaviors affect individuals, right? Like you can't inflate the currency to smithereens if everyone's holding Bitcoin. You can't get away with that. You can't get away with, reckless government spending that, ultimately is backed by this printing machine if everyone's holding Bitcoin, right? And so there's some accountability that I think Bitcoin brings to the table that I think what the sad thing that I've come to the conclusion of, and something that Bitcoin has taught me, is that governments are just a bunch of human beings. Governments are run just by fallible humans at the end of the day, even if they're really smart, even if they're really talented, whatever that may be, even if they believe in the same things I believe in, at the end of the day, they are just humans. And it's like impossible that they won't fall to their own greed, right? To the level of their own greed or their own fallibility at some point. And like without accountability, governments, regardless of whether they're left or right or whatever, will abuse power, right? Absolute power corrupts absolutely is like one of the most important things that I've learned in the Bitcoin space. And I truly believe that. And I think that the only way to protect ourselves as citizens from that kind of fundamental human reality that's sort of been proven for every government since the beginning of time is to have currencies, for instance, that are not government run, right? And that the governments can't control, and that that ultimately hold them accountable. So yeah, that's sort of my, I think that's like at the crux of sort of my political journey, is that I think Bitcoin really taught me, kind of showed me where governments are just kind of fallible human beings, a collection of fallible human beings. And like, I'd rather trust the code. I'd rather trust machines.
You and me both. I feel like if you've been spent enough time in the Bitcoin ecosystem, it's hard not to walk away with some of these ideas. And your journey, I think my journey would be similar to yours, although I think I've always been perhaps a little bit more right of center. But I've really stepped back. In fact, anytime I have a conversation, I'm like, what's your worldview? I don't want to know your politics. I want to know what your worldview is. How do you see the world? And then let's talk about whatever it is you want to talk about. So I lied. I did have one more question, if you can just bear with me. And this one, actually, it almost feels like we're going backwards a little bit. I think I was listening to a different interview, and you mentioned the idea of regulation is something that you're very interested in and you're following. And obviously, you just talked about the fact that, you know, our political systems operate a certain way. You have a view. I share that view, by the way, so I'm biased. But what do you think is needed for regulatory clarity for this space to allow it to both thrive, but also do it in a way that is sustainable? And I use that term because I think it matters. I just get very, very concerned when I say that, because it sounds like a political slogan. It sounds like all of a sudden I'm asking for regulators to put their thumb on the scale and say this needs to win or that needs to win. And that's not really what I mean. I think there's certain things that are valuable for the space, like disclosures that could be useful. I think other sandboxes, maybe something that I think could be very valuable that I haven't seen yet. But I guess from someone who's really interested in it, what's your perspective on the regulatory landscape as it is now and where it needs to go in order for us to be able to hold our governments accountable with this technology?
So I think generally speaking, where I've sort of landed on this is that I think having the government involved in markets is generally not great. I think the government is like way, way, way overstepped its bounds with a whole host of different markets. I mean, and this is not just specific to crypto. I mean, you could take this to like corn subsidies and all of these different ways that like the government interferes with free markets to its detriment, right? And where there's like obvious like evidence for problems that have come out of those policies. That being said, I think where I land on this, and you already mentioned it, was, you know, the only rule that there should be when government's not intervene, right, in this sort of non-intervention sort of worldview that I have, is that people should be held accountable for lying. And I would say that, you know, potentially something like not having appropriate disclosures would constitute some form of that, right? That's some form of untruth or dishonesty. So yeah, that's sort of like my point of view, is that like people should be able to trade and operate in free markets however they want. People should be able to, you know, trade shitcoins, buy shitcoins, whatever, as long as they have access to things like disclosure information, as long as also there's no like arbitrage opportunities. Like I think like one of the issues right now that I don't hear people talking about enough is, you know, we have different rules for crypto and different rules for equities. A lot of people say, oh, we should apply the same rules to equities that we apply for crypto. No, that's not my point of view. If it were up to me, I think a lot of the rules that we have for equities are also really problematic, and we should get rid of those too. But definitely having two separate rule sets creates a lot of problems, because you're creating it's a government invented incentive for people to build technologies using blockchains when like they might not actually be the most appropriate technologies to use, right? Like there's a lot of instances where people are building stuff on blockchain just because they want to drop a token and make money and taking advantage of retail, when like actually blockchains don't make any sense to use in that particular like instance or in that particular use case. So, you know, I think like the more we can get the government out of markets, the better, on all sides, equities, crypto, et cetera. But absolutely, I think where we need to have law and order is in like free and fair information and disclosures and honesty, right? Like, you know, free market all day long, people should be able to do whatever the hell they want. But like if you're caught lying or being dishonest with somebody you're doing business with, you should be held accountable for that.
Yeah, well, like that. I'm not sure we're going to get that.
That's like the pipe dream. Like that's like where I'm going with this over time. But yeah, no, I agree. I think we're a very, very long time away from these regulations, certainly, especially on the equity side. I mean, like no one's even talking about changing these laws on the equity side. So.
Well, I'm laughing because that's exactly what I asked for. Where would you like it to go? You give it to me and I'm going, oh, that sounds difficult. It's like, well, of course it's difficult. It was difficult. It took 60 plus years to bring this technology together. And then it's been 10 plus 14 years, however long it's been at this point. It takes a while.
That is the North Star. Like the North Star is you have no intervention in like what people can do, what people can build, what people can trade, what people can charge. But where you have government involvement is at the level of like no one's allowed to lie. No one's allowed to be dishonest. No one's allowed to, et cetera. And that can look a lot of different ways, right? That might look like lack of disclosures. That might look like, unethical marketing in various different forms. So
it's kind of the one of the core market failures is asymmetric information. So right there, you've just hit on that. And let's hope. Let's fingers crossed. We'll see what happens in the United States in November and see what that brings. But Isabel Foxen Duke, it's been an absolute pleasure having you here to talk ordinals. Talk your view on the existing blockchain or Bitcoin chain and where it's going to go. I really want to thank you for the time. Where can people find you and what would you like them to know before we let you go?
Honestly, I think probably the best place to hit me up or see what I'm up to is Twitter. I'm pretty relatively active on Twitter. Also, if folks are, want to learn more about Unbroken Chain and want to learn more about the Ordinals fund, they can go to unbrokenchain.fund. You can read all about our fund there. But yeah, hit me up on Twitter. Like if you want to talk, hit me up on Twitter. My DMs are open.
Okay. Open and honest. I love it. All right. Well, thank you again. Hopefully we'll be able to bring you back maybe later in the bull cycle when all the prices have gone wild and we're trying to get a fresh perspective on where people can look to invest.
Awesome. I love it. Thank you.